In the great city of Alexandria, under a sun that made marble glow, a child was born whose name would outlive empires. Her name was Hypatia. She arrived in a century torn between old gods and new faiths, between inherited myth and measured proof, where ideas could ignite crowds as easily as they could illuminate minds. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was a mathematician and philosopher who believed the universe spoke in numbers. While other girls learned the loom, Hypatia learned Euclid. While Market shouted of spice and glass, she traced circles and angles, hunting the quiet grammar of truth. In shaded porticos, papyrus crackled like soft fire as she read. She followed Ptolemy through the heavens, counted the wandering stars, and felt the tug of Plato's questions. What is real? What only shadow? Alexandria fed her hunger. Ships carried silk, but also arguments. Priests chanted near philosophers who argued about the soul. Soldiers marched past scholars drawing conics in dust. Hypatia listened, then asked better questions. She wanted causes, not slogans, proof, not rumour. When Theon tuned an astrolabe, she learned to map the sky. When he corrected a manuscript, she learned to map thought, line by line, claim by claim. Word spread of the scholar's daughter, who solved problems that silenced grown men. Students tested her with riddles of geometry. She answered with clean lines and a cleaner voice. She spoke without boasting, taught without condescension, and drew strength not from rank but from clarity. In a city where temples were falling and churches rising, she stayed loyal to a different sanctuary, the discipline of reason. She felt the weather change, tension in sermons, sharpness in whispers, yet refused to treat learning as a crime. Truth, she held, needed courage as much as brilliance. At dusk, the lighthouse cast a path of fire across the sea. Hypatia watched and imagined another beacon, the patient light of understanding, sweeping across unquiet minds. She would teach and argue and listen. She would keep the conversation human when crowds forgot how. And somewhere beyond the harbour, destiny waited. A classroom filled with faces from distant coasts. A city that would ask too much of its teachers, and a history that would remember, because she made remembering possible. For now, there was study, there were stars, and there was a young woman learning how to give them a voice.
As years passed, Hypatia's fame spread far beyond the streets where she once studied in silence. Students travelled from distant coasts, Cyrene, Athens, Antioch, drawn by the story of a woman who taught philosophy as clearly as she taught mathematics. They came to Alexandria carrying questions about the universe, the soul, and the fragile balance between reason and faith. Hypatia welcomed them into halls lined with scrolls and instruments. She explained Euclid's proofs with the same precision she used to chart the heavens through Ptolemy's tables. Her father had given her tools: the astrolabe for the skies, the hydrometer for water, and the language of numbers for the mind. She turned them into keys, unlocking mysteries for every eager listener. She wrote commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica and Apollonius's Conics, making difficult works clearer for future generations. Some said her revisions saved entire texts from being lost to time, preserving the wisdom of centuries in a city where knowledge often burned before it was read. But Hypatia did more than teach formulas and diagrams. She taught a way of thinking, how to question without fear, how to debate without hatred, how to hold truth above pride. the classroom, philosophers and Christians, pagans and skeptics, all sat together, listening as she spoke with a calm authority that silenced prejudice.
Among her students was Synesius of Cyrene, who would one day become a Christian bishop, yet still write to her with reverence, calling her his guide, his teacher, his beloved philosopher. Through him, her ideas travelled into circles of power, influencing rulers and scholars alike. Outside the lecture halls, Alexandria was changing. Temples crumbled, churches rose, and the streets grew louder with arguments about faith and empire. But inside Hypatia's school, there was only the steady voice of reason, a sanctuary where ideas could breathe, even as the city held its breath. She became more than a teacher. She was an advisor to Orestes, the Roman governor, speaking on matters of politics as easily as she spoke of geometry. Her wisdom crossed the boundary between classroom and council chamber, her words shaping decisions in a city pulling itself apart. For a moment in history, it seemed as though reason might hold against the coming storm, because Hypatia stood at its centre, calm, brilliant, unafraid. Alexandria was no longer the city of her youth. Temples that once sang with prayers to ancient gods now stood in ruins, while churches rose higher each year, their bells drowning the old hymns. The empire itself was shifting, its power, its faith, its very soul dividing under the weight of new beliefs and old loyalties. Hypatia, brilliant and fearless, had never taken sides in the battles of faith. She spoke only for knowledge, for reason, for the quiet dignity of asking questions when others shouted answers. Yet that too became dangerous in a city where suspicion grew faster than wisdom. As advisor to Orestes, the Roman governor, Hypatia urged dialogue instead of bloodshed. But to those who wanted power dressed as piety, her voice was a threat. Rumours began to curl through Alexandria's streets like smoke, that the philosopher stood against the church, that she bewitched the governor, that learning itself was rebellion. Crowds gathered, sermons sharpened, the space for reason narrowed to a single woman riding her chariot through streets that now watched with more anger than awe. One March morning in 415 AD, as the sun struck the marble steps of the Caesareum, they came for her. A mob led by men who feared her influence more than they feared ignorance itself. They dragged her from the chariot into the temple's shadow. Stones struck first, then shards of pottery, jagged and merciless. The woman who had charted the stars fell beneath a city that chose fury over thought. When it was over, Alexandria fell silent. Even those who had hated her felt the weight of what had been lost. A mind, a teacher, a legacy, all shattered on the floor of a city that would never again be whole. Yet ideas do not die as bodies do. Her students carried her name into books, into memory, into centuries beyond the empire that had destroyed her. To this day, Hypatia stands as more than a mathematician, more than a philosopher. She is a symbol of courage against fanaticism, of knowledge against fear, of reason's light against the long dark that followed her death. The stars she once mapped still burn above us, and somewhere, in their patient silence, they remember the woman who gave them a voice.
History carries countless stories, Some echo across the ages, others fade into the quiet shadows of time. Among them stands Hypatia, a voice of reason in an age of chaos, a beacon of wisdom in a world torn between faith and fear. The stars she once mapped still remember her name. They remember the woman who gave them a voice, and every mind that still seeks the light of understanding remembers her too. For knowledge, like starlight, may dim through the centuries, but it never truly dies.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and join us again as we unveil more secrets behind the veil of history.